Welcome to Disposable Society, where we sift through the garbage that is stereotypes and discrimination about disability and pick out the treasures of advocacy, inclusion, and innovation. My name is Caitlin. Today, I am wearing a long-sleeve brown sweater, a blue undershirt, my hair is in a ponytail, and my bangs are to the side per usual. This week, we will be talking all things healthcare. If you can, pause the video and ask yourself, what barriers arrive when someone with a disability goes to a doctor? Or how do medical institutions assert power over people with disabilities? Or what does the medical framework centered on fixing a problem signal to people with disabilities and society at large? We will answer all of these questions by first analyzing a fairy tale, Hans my Hedgehog, to distinguish the difference between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. We will then see how two research studies show the limitations of the medical model for people with disabilities. Finally, we will get to the juicy part and have a dance with social theorist Michel Foucault. Just a little two-step, nothing intricate yet. Join me in this week's episode called An Apple a Day Keeps the Doctor Away. In the fairy tale Hans my Hedgehog, the main character, Hans, is born with the upper half of a hedgehog and the bottom half of a human. Because of his appearance, his parents hide him behind a stove for 7 years. However, he goes out into the world when he is older and becomes skilled at herding geese and pigs. When his parents find out about this skill, they openly welcome him. Hans sells some of the pigs and geese he herded to benefit the town, which then also welcomes him. Then he goes out into the world a second time and gives aid to a king who is lost. The king offers Hans his daughter, but she does not want Hans due to his appearance. So he pricks her with one of his quills and she runs away. The third and final time Hans goes out into the world, he helps another king who offers him his daughter. She marries Hans. To his new wife, Hans reveals that his hedgehog upper half is just a costume. Accompanied by his new family, he goes to his parents and shows his transformation. And they all live happily ever after, and the whole spiel, right? Fairy tales often follow a trajectory that results in transformation, and disability is often utilized to symbolize this transformation in some way. The structure of fairy tales is always problem, quest, reform. Oftentimes, the problem in the problem-quest-reform equation consists of disability. Think the Hunchback of Notre Dame, Beast in Beauty and the Beast, Scar in The Lion King. In Hans my Hedgehog, Hans' disability is his being born with an apparent upper body of a hedgehog, a prickly situation. Hans' quest includes having to prove himself over and over again to society. First to his parents and community, then to the larger community. Only after he proves his societal value, his worth, his ability to contribute and to curate a family, does he hit the final mark of the fairy tale equation, reformation. In modernity, people with disabilities have been subjected to a similar problem-quest-reform equation. We call it the medical model. Like we discussed last week, as the mystery surrounding disability lifted and medicine became more prevalent, the medical institution encapsulated social attitude about physical disability. But although the belief system shifted, the recognizable fairy tale formula did not. The medical model of disability diagnoses a problem, prescribes the patient with a treatment quest, and monitors the patient's progress back to health or reform. Health being defined in narrow terms of norms. That dirty word again. According to Leduc, the author of Disfigured, where I came into contact with Hans my Hedgehog, the fairy tale, the medical model of disability links a body directly to a diagnosis and places emphasis on the intervention of medicine as a way of solving or eradicating the particular disability or condition. In short, it defines a problem and it does everything in its power to fix it. Disability advocates, however, look to the social model of disability, which holds that the disability of individuals is, in fact, maintained by systemic barriers, exclusion, and negative attitudes towards these disabilities more than the physical limitations of the conditions themselves. We will look at two research studies that exemplify this statement. The ADA, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 provide regulations that healthcare institutions and physicians must comply with in order to avoid discrimination of people with disabilities. The regulations require reasonable accommodations, equitable care, and that no patient with a disability is refused. Research suggests that medical physicians admit to being unknowledgeable about ADA regulations. The same research study found that physicians do not know that deciding what reasonable accommodations a patient with a disability needs is supposed to be a collaborative process between physician and patient. Another study found that people with disabilities are simultaneously more likely to have mental health challenges and also more likely to not have mental health addressed. Researchers supply three reasons for this. 1, lack of insurance. 2, lack of accessibility of physical spaces. And 3, lack of addressing their mental health concerns in a meaningful way. When asked about experience with mental health care, patients detailed that they encountered misplaced assumptions, medical trauma and gaslighting, interpersonal ableism, lack of disability knowledge, and accessibility barriers. Narratives described professionals correlating mental health either completely to the disability or avoided the topic of disability altogether. I have had personal experience with not having my disability addressed in therapy. I struggled with an eating disorder when I was a teenager that was very much intertwined with my negative body image and lack of bodily control surrounding my arm and my arm's appearance. I will probably not bring this up again, but I think it's important to touch on it today since we are talking about mental health care. I surely was not going to bring up my arm to my therapist. I was called a con man for being able to fool people into not noticing my arm. And that was by my father. That was the biggest praise that he really ever gave me, was that I was a con man. It was a term of endearment from him. You know, it's absurd and funny looking back now, but also, you know, I was praised for my ability to con people from knowing about it, hiding under sleeves, and not partaking in activities that would show my cards. I remember my therapist asking me about my arm once. I told her I didn't really think about it, and that was the end of that. She later told me I compartmentalized in life, that I only presented the good parts of life. I think this very much followed from systemic social molding about how I was supposed to perceive my disability. It was abnormal. In Subjective Bodies, Martin Sullivan applies Foucault to conceptualize some of these societal power dynamics. Foucault theorizes that discipline, surveillance, and punishment are central modes by which human beings are subjectivized, literally transformed into subjects. These modes of subjectification emerged at the end of the 18th century when, as Sullivan explains, the target of punishment shifted from the corporeal to the psychological. When we're talking about corporeal, we're referring to the physical body, so corporeal punishment could consist of physical bodily harm, torture, and death. Psychological punishment is more subtle, a breaking down of the spirit, so to speak, or of the mental state. This is done through criminalization, surveillance, isolation, and discipline. This initially emerged in jails and prisons with the goal of taking a deviant, someone who, like we discussed last week, has deviated from the social norm, and maybe they really have committed a heinous act, or maybe they have not, labeling this deviant into the subject criminal, isolating them in a prison, and enacting psychological punishment on them. The end goal of this manipulation of carceral subject bodies is that the subject will emerge as a reformed citizen who is closer to a more quote-unquote normal new subject. We can see the fairy tale formula we discussed earlier: the problem, the quest, reform, equation, right in this carceral punishment model. One prominent example of psychological punishment is surveillance. You may have heard of Foucault's panopticon metaphor that used philosopher Jeremy Bentham's architectural design to illustrate how surveillance works as a form of biopower. The design features a centralized prison guard station that is encircled by the prisoner's cells, the utility being that the guard has a line of vision to every prisoner at any given moment. There is no escaping the gaze of the surveyor. Foucault explains further. It was believed that, locked in a cell, the criminal could not evade the ever-present gaze of the warder, a gaze that would gradually be interiorized to the point that the prisoner becomes his own overseer, exercising surveillance over and against himself. We even see this self-surveilling and ranking amongst ourselves in the disability community. I have heard podcasts with people with disabilities admitting they have adopted an internal hierarchy of disability in order to harness a sense of power and greater belonging in comparison to other people with disabilities. Continuing with Foucault's theory, this carceral system of punishment was then utilized in and between other social institutions, schools, corporations, governmental institutions, etc. This is where his concept biopower comes from. Biopower is this grid of institutions that adopt a carceral system of punishment onto individuals' bodies and social bodies, like groups of people or populations. In the essay, Subjective Bodies, Sullivan applies biopower specifically to medical institutions by analyzing narratives of individuals in the spinal cord unit at Otera Spinal Rehabilitation Unit in South Auckland, New Zealand. Many institutions create people into objects and subjects. Pause and ask yourself, what identities are you subjected to when you walk into a school, a hospital, a place of employment? When I am at work, for example, I am an event lead. I must introduce myself to wedding planners and say, "Hi, I'm Caitlin, event lead." In that setting, that is my entire identity to the clients I come into contact with. A subject in a place of employment is part of a dynamic, multi-tiered hierarchy with many different levels. The patients with paraplegia at Otera Rehab are not in the employment hierarchy at the treatment center. Everyone else in the hospital setting has power and the potential to gain capital and climb the hierarchy of power. The patients have no power and no prospect of gaining any. They are dehumanized. Foucault discusses that those in power assign rigid, correcting training that is specific to those objects and subjects with the goal to make them docile, that is, easily manipulated and controllable, and normal. In the spinal unit, medical professionals subjectified people with spinal cord injuries into paraplegics. This slight linguistic reframing may seem harmless, but Sullivan explains this is a dividing practice that separates individuals into units. The individuals will eventually adopt these identities into their psyche and believe these subjects to be who they are. In disability culture, for example, we do not say disabled person, we say person with a disability. Disabled person linguistically morphs the individual's total identity with their disability, as if that is who they are. It subjectifies their personhood entirely to that one detail about them. Saying person with a disability leaves space for that individual to have multiple characteristics, while cluing the audience into the detail that they have a disability, which may be of relevant context. Similarly, we don't say someone is disabled. We say someone has a disability. Disability is not who I am. I am an artist, an academic, a vegan, a loving partner, a friend, an event lead. I am so many things, and each matters. With power regimes comes arbiters of resistance to that subjugating power. One woman, for example, pleaded for an indwelling catheter so that she would be able to push fluids and get some relief from an UTI. Staff refused, so she put it in herself. Sullivan discusses that most of the medical techniques were accepted by patients. Only totalizing authoritarian techniques were resisted. In a way, Otera is a crash course of social dominance. For me, having a congenital disability, I received a constant, slow leak of institutional subjectification and objectification targeted at my physical disability from the moment I was born. Correcting training was utilized to normalize me and acted upon me by those closest to me. Out of love, of course. Some therapies were used as direct behavioral punishment, though. For example, they bought me a stationary bike that had handlebars that moved back and forth. The purpose of the bike was to help me gain range of motion in my arm. The bike was kept in a room in the basement with no windows. The basement which I was already scared of as a child, but I was supposed to ride it for 30 minutes every day, and punishments and rewards were often attached to my having rode the bike or not having rode the bike. So my docile body was cultivated primarily in those formative years. I had to heal these deep-seated developmental barriers, and one woman's narrative from the Sullivan essay added to this healing journey. As she reflects on her journey since she has left Otera, she discusses having framed her body as totally outside of herself. It being the baby and she the mom. She said it helps her to care and love her body while not entangling her entire identity within it. My experience is totally different from hers. As I mentioned earlier, I completely compartmentalized my disability, completely dissociated from it. I would not tell employers out of fear of not being hired, because many jobs require you to be able to lift a certain amount of weight over your head. I would not tell men I was interested in fear of them perceiving me as less than or weak. I wanted so badly for it to not exist, for it to not be seen. But because of this, when someone would ask why my arm looked this way or why I was performing a movement in a different way, my disillusioned identity as a con woman was shattered, and I didn't know how to process it. I didn't know who I was. Further, because I ignored my arm, I did no continuing therapy when I was a teenager and in my 20s, and it got worse. I also hurt other areas of my body by performing jobs that I should not have been performing. I technically still do this with my current job, but I'm at least trying to find a new career path at this point, and I have told everyone at work. But treating my arm like something to nurture, that framing struck me. Having someone with a disability speak so lovingly of their body is foreign to me and emotional, and I so want to connect with that. I want to love her and cherish all of the uniqueness she brings to the eclectic personality that makes me who I am. I want to gain true power over my body and my reality, a power that is my own and that no one can budge from my sense of self. I began that process 18 months ago, and the narrative of the woman from Otera Spinal Unit is going to help keep momentum. I hope my narrative can do the same for someone as well. Okay, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. It means the world to me, and I hope we can continue to build a community. Before we go, I want to provide some updates and corrections from last week's episode. I think I was over-enthusiastic about South Bend's public transit system, Transpo, and a bit too forgiving. I have since had some discussions, and while it maintains accessibility measures, there are continual issues with driver shortages which cause certain routes to be missed. In addition, I want to elaborate on the paratransit service, Access. Paratransit in general is inconvenient. It requires scheduling a pickup time far in advance. If an emergency presents itself, paratransit is not an option. I do not intend to disillusion anyone. Overall, there remain many limitations within public transit systems for all riders, not just people with disabilities. If you are in the South Bend area and are an IUSB student, though, you can present your Crimson Card to ride for free. I felt inclined to share more of my own story today. Sociologically, placing personal experiences within a broader social and historical context is part of the sociological imagination conceptualized by C. Wright Mills. It is paradigm to doing great sociological work. The next couple of episodes, we will be honing into social and political theory. I can't wait. Today we dabbled, but next episode, social theory will be centralized as we talk about Gramsci and subalternity. Until then, upcycle what you can